long time, yeah.
Been in such
Thank
a
you.
long while, eh?
Thank you.
Karibu sana.
Asante.
Yeah. Right. Indeed. He's hoping that all is well with you. And of course, in just a short while ago, I received a notification on my phone that my bedtime is actually on, and so the phone is starting to wind down. I'm telling you, we are not just about to start winding down. We are getting started right here on The Summit, your favorite talk show that comes your way every Wednesday, 9 p.m. live right here on Rwanda Television. My name, as always, is Eugene Anangwe. Listen, we're going to have a very great conversation right here, like we've always done over the past few weeks. And our conversation tonight is centered on Africa, like we do always, and it is on the area around the road to self-reliance for the continent. What would it look like for Africa to actually be self-reliant? That is what we're asking you right here. And I'm also joined by those who are joining us from far and wide, like none other than Levi Kabwato, who's joining us all the way from South Africa. Levi, thank you so much for making time for joining us right here on the show tonight.
Thanks so much, Eugene. Always lovely to connect with you, and
Perfect.
really happy to be here. Such an honor.
Yes, we also have Angel Kwemo, who's actually the president and CEO of a strategic group. Thank you so much for making time to join us, Angel. I know African issues are passionate and so dear to your heart. Thank you for making time for us tonight.
Thank you very much for having me.
Right, perfect. I'll also be definitely introducing our guest right here in studio. He's a good friend, and of course, it's been a long time coming, and it's good that we are reconnecting tonight on this very important conversation. But like we always say, the summit is your show, and all the time we say that you need to be able to participate in this conversation, and all you need to do is just tweet us if you're on Twitter, and of course you can always remember to add the hashtag #TheSummitRW. Remember, we are tracking that particular hashtag to be able to read your feedback. If you're passionate about Africa, this is a conversation that you do not want to miss. We have been able to see several people, of course, joining us and giving their feedback as we, been coming through on this particular conversation. And let me just read some of those particular comments. I saw one earlier on, and I want to be able to check it out right here. It came and disappeared. Technology issues. Right there. But what we're saying is that the African Development Bank is actually saying that Africa will actually be able to use, or could be able to use, its natural capital as what it can be able to use to actually finance most of its needs, especially the Sustainable Development Goals. We have interesting statistics, and we want to be able to ask ourselves the key question: why is it that Africa is still considered a poor country? Why is it that we are still not self-reliant? That is the big question that we are asking right here tonight on the program. Let me bring you to speed on the guest that we have right here in studio, who's joining me right here physically, is Professor Alfred Vizoza, who's the Professor of Agricultural Economics. Thank you so much for making time to be with us right here on the summit.
Thank you.
Like we had also said earlier on, we're joined by Levi Kabwato, who's a social and political commentator, and of course he's also a major contributor on the Pan-African Review. And also we have Angel Kwemo, president and CEO, a strategic group. And of course, all of us are going to be trying to put our minds and brains on this particular important conversation. Let's start off by trying to understand, and I want to start with you, Angel, because you have been very vocal and you've been following African matters. You're very passionate about them from where you sit, especially when it comes to empowering, the women on the continent. A lot has been happening since 2016 when it comes to the reforms for the African Union, and the aim was to try and refocus the AU's priorities on fewer areas. It was also to review its structure, to realign institutions, safeguard and expand citizens' participation, most importantly, enhance financial independence. 2016, we are now 2023. From where you sit, what kind of scorecard will you be giving? Are you a proud African who feels that a lot has changed in terms of these reforms that were aimed at trying to make the African Union the organ that actually tries to assist on issues to do with the continent is concerned?
Thank you very much, Eugene, for having me and for creating this very unique discussion on African independence. It comes down to our independence. If you look at the history, for example, We fought in the 16 for our political independence, for our civil rights, for political rights, but we forgot to focus on economic rights. And what we're facing today with African Union, we all know that they are underfunded. If you look at the number that you shared in your introduction, you look at the expenses that that's supposed to be covered on the programming, on security. So it's really, I don't want to be pessimistic or I want to be sad, but it's like in Africa you're almost dancing the tango. But between 2005 2012, it was Africa Rising. We are advocating for progress in Africa, showing that not just in Africa we don't only have it's not half empty, but it's half full. But now we have the security situation almost everywhere. We look at the news, so you wonder, even if you consider being self-reliant, so all the situation we have in all the wars, the instability, sometimes they're managed by external sources, and sometimes it's self-inflicted. But at the end of the day, who's going to pay for it? So even if you say the program, this $200 million for peace, security, and African Union by the donors, it's not free. So I remember, I don't know if you remember, it was President Trump who was not very political on his talking point. He was telling people that we want to come and support for the war, but who's going to pay the bill? So that money, even though it's funded by the donors, somebody's paying for it. So we need to figure out what is our priority. It's all come down to leadership.
It all comes down to leadership.
Determine what their priorities are.
Right. Like they always say, there's no free lunch. I'm going to come back to you, Levi, but before we do that, I mean, some of you might be wondering, why did we start with Angel? I mean, we are African, and Africa is definitely our business, and we have been trained well. We always do ladies first. We start ladies first. But let me bring the conversation back home here. Professor Alfred, I mean, you have been observing the happenings within the continent, especially when it comes to this particular clarion call for self-reliance. And of course, we've heard Angel says we seem to be in a tango or a dancing mode in that particular sense, and there are many slogans that keep coming: Africa Rising, the Africa we want, and all that. Are these things working? I mean, if you were to compare today's Africa, and especially the African Union, and the African Union prior to 2016, when the reforms or the conversation around reforms started coming, do you sense a feeling of hope that we are moving somewhere?
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me also take this opportunity to thank you for the invitation first. We have also to acknowledge that there's some progress that has been done as far as Africa is concerned, but also the reforms itself. Before, we did not have like the African Agenda 2026-63, but today at least we know what is the direction. We know what we want as Africans. But still, you will also recall from your introduction, when you look at the notes, where do we get the funding of all these programs that we are putting in the reforms? Where comes the resources? Where comes the capital? That shows that we are still dependent on developed countries. And this has even pushed me to think, what is a self-reliant Africa? So from the economy perspective, it's when you are saying that you are not trading with other countries, you have your own capital, you are doing your own investments. But when you link with the global trends currently, you cannot find a country that is closed, with the economy that is closed. But the most important is to understand, though we have our interest as Africans, and also other countries have also their own interests, where do we gain as Africans? So in that perspective, we can understand exactly what our needs, how do we tangle the issues and the challenges facing the communities and Africans in general. So, but as you mentioned, the reforms, this is one step which is necessary, but not sufficient. So the sufficiency comes when now we start now translating some of these ambitions and visions into concrete changes that we see into the community.
Right. Interesting that you mentioned that, some reforms or some progress has been registered right there. But Levi, I mean, from the two panelists who've already made their initial submissions, I think there seems to be an agreement that a lot still needs to be done. From where you sit, is it a glass half empty or a glass half full when it comes to the changes and the reforms on the Africa we want to see today?
Yeah, thanks so much, Eugene, and greetings to Prof and greetings to Angel, two people I really admire. So I don't know what conspiracy you're running to bring us all on this show tonight.
Yeah.
Yeah, but let me just say this, Eugene, to begin with. I don't know if you know this and if it was some coincidence, but it's a great coincidence if it really is. 43 years ago, on the between 28 and 29 April 1980, the second extraordinary summit of the Organization of African Unity, which is, the modern day AU. What happened here was the adoption of a resolution that gave us what is called the Lagos Plan of Action for 1980 to 2000. So it was a 20-year plan that African heads of state came up with to decide the future of Africa. Now, the Lagos Plan of Action itself was coming from what was called the Monrovia Resolution. So a year before, in July 1979, African heads of state had really said, look, it's about 20 years since the first independence moment in Africa south of the Sahara, but we haven't seen a lot of progress. So I like that Angel started off with the idea of independence. The struggle for independence in Africa was essentially a struggle for freedom, and particularly economic freedom. So we must not lose sight of that. So when these African heads of state met and decided on a Lagos Plan of Action, which has now given us all these other instruments that we are now, talking about. Prof mentioned Agenda 2063. We've had so many other things in between, so many slogans in between. So for us now, 43 years, having this, 43 years later, having this conversation, and you ask me, is the glass half full or is the glass half empty? I would actually say, where is the glass, Eugene? I don't see it, right? So not to be pessimistic, it's really to say, I don't think we have looked at this problem or this challenge with the urgency that it deserves. And this is why the AU reforms proposed, I think, from about 2016, when they really started to, to gather so much momentum, really matter. And every African who's concerned about the development of this continent should actually be agitating for the speedy implementation of these reforms, but also the speedy implementation of the various mechanisms that African heads of state have for a long time now just say this is what we need to do to progress. So I'm a bit pessimistic, but I'm also saying, wait, the future still is in our hands. The struggle for independence is not complete without Africa actually becoming self-reliant.
Yeah, interesting submission, Levi. But Angel, if you listen to what Levi is saying, especially on the aspect of the lack of urgency in dealing with this very, very important subject matter of actually self-reliance, where do you see the gap? I mean, who is dropping the ball in this particular direction? Because this is a very significant issue that actually everybody or all hands should be on deck, if you're to ask me, for those who are committed to this.
Yes, I totally agree with Levi and Professor what you just said. But the continent is there's a sense of urgency, and it comes down to what I just said earlier: is political will. So we have the momentum at the moment because Africa is in a very unique position. And we have the chance to be witness of it, where the continent is not into bilateral framework anymore. The Francophone countries are not just trading the former colonial system, the French. The Francophone countries are trading with an Anglophone country. Some of them are even joining the Commonwealth. So we live in a multilateral system, and African countries now have the chance to leverage that position to change the framework. There's another African proverb that says, you don't always get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate. So our leaders need to make it a priority to get the continent self-reliant. I think we already witnesses that with 2063, with all the development agencies that are making money available for development finance. But at the end of the day, we need to make sure that it serves our people, and you have a big P, like the people in between. I remember I live in the US. So bear with me if I make comparison with the US system. It's not because I believe we have to learn from them. They have their own issue, right? after 400 years, you still have January 6th. The democracy is still challenged. So, but I remember a few years ago, when I was working energy policy, they made it a strategy for the U.S. to be free from foreign oil. It was a big slogan. All the agencies had to put policy in place to make sure they develop the energy domestically, or they could reduce the import from the Middle East or even Africa. So to use that example, on different sectors, African countries need to make it a strong commitment, and implementation is also key. Because sometimes on policy, on paper, things look very right, very fine, but implementation is a problem. You can apply the same system on food security. Our policy is nonsense. You don't understand how we are importing our wheat. You can apply that in food security, on technology, on the rest. But you have to really make it a strategy, make it a priority, and focus on implementation. Yeah,
focus on implementation. And I want to talk a bit about that, because President Paul Kagame himself, who actually chaired the team that was spearheading these reforms, when he was actually giving his updates, he did mention, and I'll quote what he said: "Unfortunately, there are some remaining items where progress has stalled, namely the reform of judicial organs, the Pan-African Parliament, the commission structures, the division of labor, and of course, he mentions that, in fact, these are the very same items I highlighted at last year's summit. This delay represents a disappointing shortcoming in our working methods." Underline the word working methods. And I want to bring this conversation back here in studio as well. Prof, when we look at that momentum in terms of the working method, in the way President Kagame puts it, especially on the aspect of lack or lack of it in terms of that commitment to implement. It's not that the ideas are not there. It's not that these conversations haven't been had, but the implementation speed, the pace. What causes this slow, sluggish way of actually implementing such urgent things like we're talking about these reforms?
Yeah, I think the first reason could be what has been already indicated, the lack of urgency to think that this is an urgent issue.
Why? Why is there a lack of urgency?
And it should not be said that for all Africans, not all Africans don't have that urgency. There are some. But remember, we are talking about Africa, which is a heterogeneous continent. It's not an homogeneous. We have different countries, we have different people, we have different challenges, we have different leadership styles. So, and if you want now to bring it and aggregate all levels of leadership, for instance, where you found the political will, you will find some governments are proactive and responding very quickly on collaborative programs or joint implementation programs, but others are still lagging behind. Let me give you a quick example. Look at some of the agreements on the Eastern African Community, for instance, or other blocks we have like COMESA and so on. How many countries are responding only to the soft aspect of regulation, law reforms, to ensure that the exchange of people and services and goods are done properly? So you will find some countries are very ahead, others are lagging behind, mainly because, one, lack of that urgency to think that they need to address the issues facing the community. Number two, there is also corruption. The process itself, it may take longer than needed because of some people along the value chain are corrupted. Now, the governance style of every country also matters. That also explains why some countries take time to respond to joint programs, joint projects, very big projects that have some multiplier effect to the community and development.
Right. That's a bit, interesting. And Levi, I don't know what you think on this, because at the end of the day, we are looking at common problems. We're not talking about problems that just face an individual African country that would push it to be able to implement faster. We have common problems across the continent. Security is a common threat for every African nation. Why is it that it would mean a lot to one African country and not mean the same to the other, especially on this issue of commitment? Just cool me a bit. What is wrong? Do we need to put all these leaders in one room, and what do we need to do so that we can be able to see a common level of commitment, especially on common issues that affect us as a continent?
Right. And Eugene, you're going to have to forgive me because I'm going to sound like a stuck record throughout the show tonight. So the preamble to the Lagos Plan of Action was actually around, harnessing the collective potential of all African countries and the collective potential of, the continent as a whole. And this is what has given birth to, the African Union as we know it today. So I think we have to pause and reflect and really say, do the people that we have, one, in leadership, are they serious about the future of this continent? So when you have something that is, say, an Agenda 2063, for example.
Yes.
Now, 2063 is about what, 40 years from now? In 40 years' time, I'm in my 70s. I have a 3-year-old daughter now. She'll be like nearing 50 around that time, right? So we have to think about the future, and we have to have leaders who care enough to really consider what the future of the continent is going to look like. Now, that's on the one end. On the other end, you now need a citizenry that is fully focused and fully committed to the development of the continent. And this is where you begin to see how, citizens make particular choices around the way they are governed, how they want to be governed, and especially how the extent to which they actually participate in how they are governed, right? So it's a bit of a complex issue when you consider the backdrop of colonialism and neocolonialism, the struggle of African states to become, in accordance with the ambition of independence. So that complexity I totally understand, but there has to be a commitment through leadership. There has to be political will, what Angel talks about. There has to be some political will that says we really need to do things differently. We really need to do things in a way that benefits Africans, right? So 3 years ago, when COVID struck the continent, we were just waiting to die on this continent, waiting for vaccines. We could not manufacture vaccines. We could not respond to the crisis on time, right? Here's a continent that's rich on natural resources, a continent that has an amazing human resource, one of the youngest populations by what, 2030, 2050, right? Amazing potential, but we are struggling on so many fronts. It should actually be a serious indictment on the political leadership on the continent that the legacy that they're going to leave behind, it's not everyone, right? But collectively, when you then say you put them in a room, as you say, you then have to ask yourself, what sort of legacy are you leaving behind? What sort of future do you want to leave for the continent? And I just think that, ultimately, it's the Africans themselves who have a say, who have to have a huge say in this matter. So we have to demand better, we have to act better, and we have to act different if we really want to see the change that we yearn for. And I think that's really, where the solution lies in the end. I think institutions really have to serve us better. They have to reform. So those reforms from about 2016, I think right now there's about a slack. I haven't seen much momentum from the AU. I haven't seen much interest at AU level, in the past 2-3 years to try and push those reforms. But it's still an outstanding matter. It's still an urgent matter that needs to be taken up by everyone, not least the African leaders themselves.
Right.
Eugene.
And I like the way you say by everyone. Angel, do you feel the citizenry of the continent have actually, surrendered their role to their so-called, leaders who are supposed to be taking these reforms seriously? Because there are those who argue that the reforms have not actually been taken, from a minimalist point of view, other than looking at them from a renewal perspective in actually coming up with a new organ that can actually be able to push for that, self-reliance for the continent when it comes to the needs of the continent as a front.
Yeah, I agree with Levy that for everything that is coming down to what every single African will do. When you look at the way, it's almost impossible until it's done. You look at the speed with which we negotiated the African Free Trade Agreement, it gives a little bit of hope. Even I myself thought we would never conclude that in less than 5 years or even 10 years. But the leaders managed to do it in 1 or 2 years. So I think if you are focused on what you want to do, I think it's achievable. Number one. Number two, as Libby and Professor was saying, that you have the youngest population, so our human resources are our biggest asset. It's also a sticking bomb. We need to look at our education system as well, because I remember back in the day, I'm only 85. We have civic education programs. So I don't think we have them today. People need to be informed so they can hold their leaders accountable, not just at the state level, even at the community level. So, and then that empowerment needs to come. It comes down to economic empowerment, because if you're not hungry, you can have an informed decision when it comes to election. For example, they will not buy your vote with one bag of rice, or they will not buy your vote with one fish. If people are informed, I think that's what happened in election in Kenya, and people control their vote, and then they manage to have the leaders accountable, and they influence the election. So I know it's not always about democracy or transfer of power and the rest. Even that, on democracy, I will be a little bit provocative, because we also have to think about our own political system.
Yeah.
Because it works in the West, it may not work for us. I don't know, but we need to think about our political system and find ways to hold our leaders accountable.
Finding ways to hold our leaders accountable. I want us to talk a bit about the area of, the resources that the continent has. The African Development Bank is actually saying that, it is quite possible that Africa's natural capital can be an option to financing most of its sustainable development goals, and we'll be talking a bit about how that is possible. We know that 75% of African countries have access to the sea. This is actually an area that they can tap into, especially when it comes to the blue economy. But I want us to take a very, very short break so that we can be able to just, warm up a bit, so that when we come back, we'll be able to read also some feedback from those who are actually watching us tonight. If there's any statement that you've heard on this particular show right away, please feel free to actually comment on it if you feel like you have different opinions on the conversations that we're having right here on the show tonight. Share your thoughts. This is our continent. We need to all have a say in how it is actually being managed, and especially on the road to a self-reliant continent. Talk to us, and of course, stay with us. We're seeing you in just a while when we come back from the break. Oh, I'm told we need to just continue. Okay, and that I like, because I have the energy to actually continue on. Prof, let me bring you back on this particular conversation and this particular area of the resources, because Africa is widely blessed with natural capital or resources. We are talking about 75% having access to the sea, and of course the blue economy has actually a global potential which is estimated to about 1.5 trillion US dollars. We know that 30% of global mineral reserves are here on the continent. But sadly, the resources that we're talking about that are supposed to actually make the continent self-reliant financially and in every way is actually what is dividing the continent. This is actually what is making us even fight each other. How do we work around this so that it can be able to be of benefit for the continent?
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think this also goes with the political will we talked about, but also the involvement of the community, but a community that is educated and is aware of the advantages that you can find in those natural resources. And then this goes in the past, where you used to see a bush as a bush. But this year you recognize a forest as a resource, because you know what comes out of the forest, the timber and other products linked to that. So we acknowledge that there are resources in the continent. But even the strategic plans, we do acknowledge them in different countries. But most of those countries that have even more resources are the most receiving the aid, the development aid. From developed countries. I was looking at some statistics. Among the top 10 recipients of official aid for development, there is Ethiopia that comes number 1. There is also DRC that comes as number 4. So DRC, we know that it is one of the countries with more natural resources. But it's the highest, one of the top 10 recipients of the aid. And then the aid, when you look at the constituents of that aid, majority, as you have seen in the introductory statistics, goes to humanitarian, goes to conflict, goes to peace. It's not going to economic development to transform like the bioeconomy you're talking in the benefits of different citizens or to create employment for many people.
Yeah.
So when you look at the forests that we find in different countries, who is using those forests or the products from those forests? How are we able to translate them into products and services that are locally consumed or traded to ensure that the income is also generated among the communities?
Right.
So it still comes on planning, strategic planning, that's number one. Number two, have commitment of leadership, national leadership, have commitment of citizens with the critical thinking to even question what is not going on.
Yeah.
I think when Africans will be able to ask their leaders to be accountable, to say, oh, we have elected you, now it's 5 years.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what
What
you have
you've done for us?
For us. What you said you are going to increase the economy from this percentage to this percentage. This is what we are seeing. You said you are going to create such number of job creation for the youth. How many jobs have been created? You said you are going to construct number of kilometers of roads. How many do we have? So the extent to which the community, the citizens, will be educated to be critical, to have a critical thinking, to question and run accountable their governments, that's really also going to change a lot. So unless, let me just give you an example, if we have like a performance contract in Rwanda, where every citizen is participating to even question the leaders, what is happening. You have seen Umushikirano, for instance, where everything is spoken in public to show what is the performance. So to what extent all countries in Africa are doing that? And this is not a new concept. The performance contract is not a new concept. It's not unique for Rwanda. It's a concept that is for all African countries. But the extent to which every country is applying that is different. So I'm saying this simply to say that we acknowledge resources are available, but how do we unblock or unlock the potentials among the citizens, the leadership, to use them for the benefits of the country? It remains a challenge.
It remains a challenge. Angel, what's your thought process? Because I need you to just try to educate me like a 2-year-old. How is it that the continent, sitting on all these resources with billions of dollars when it comes to the turnaround in terms of the value, is still considered as a poor continent? What's the issue? If today the African leaders were listening to you and they had the power to change this narrative based on their opinion or your advice, what is it that you'd be telling them?
To unlock those potential, I'm a strong believer of the private sector. The government has the role of creating the framework. They should work in tandem with the private sector. Because at the end of the day, they are the ones that will be creating jobs. Unless they create an enabling environment to attract investors, to process those natural resources, and negotiate the cost of the capital. Because you know, when you invest in oil and gas in Latin America, you pay, I think, 3%. If you negotiate the same agreement in somewhere in Africa, you pay almost 14 or 15%. So the cost of capital for a resource development are unfair. So we really need to invest in our infrastructure to make sure we process the natural resources in the continent, so allow us to create jobs, combat poverty, educate the mass so they can be able to exercise their political right. It's like a circle. So, and that's the only solution we can, because even if you all know that if you want to build the industry, you want to build the economy, you need to have infrastructure, and you cannot have that without investment. If there's no strong institution, if the investors are not secure to come into the country because of corruption or weak judicial system, there's no way you can develop a country. A normal investor today have 54 choices. So you only don't just have to have a good indicator, you need to be among the best to attract the good investors. So that's what I would tell our political leaders: create an enabling environment for the private sector to thrive.
create an enable environment for the private sector to thrive. Levi, what would you be telling them, especially on the issue of value addition? Because most of these resources actually ends up coming back to the continent with them having, value added on them, and then they are sold back into the continent, at exorbitant prices. We know of Nigeria, which has actually told one of the big, those who are actually putting out electric vehicles, and they said, if you want to take our minerals to be able to, manufacture or create the batteries, you need to actually set up the plant here in Nigeria. Are our leaders able to actually look in the face at these particular big investors, big countries, big Western nations, and tell them such a thing? Are these conversations really taking place, if you to analyze this?
Yeah, so those are conversations that are long overdue, and we need to have that. I think it was Angel earlier on who mentioned that we need to have strong negotiators, who are always fighting for Africa's position. Look, Eugene, I'm from Malawi, right? And we have large forestry reserves there. At some point, these forests were just getting decimated, and we're exporting timber. But Malawi was also importing toothpicks at the time, right? So this is just like a sad reality of what we have to go through. But I just wanted to compliment what Angel was saying by also talking about the resources within the countries that we have. I'm fairly traveled on the continent, and every day, every time I'm, whether in Kigali or in Lilongwe, in Joburg, I see young people who are really trying their best, right? Trying their best to sell whatever they can do, trying their best to start businesses, trying their best, to just eke out something, on a daily basis. Now, this is the energy that we need to tap into, right? So you have to look then at maybe what Angel was also saying around what is the ease of doing business in a particular country. How fast can we get, startups? How fast can we get, young people plugged in, young people with ideas, innovators? How can they be supported to quickly, adapt their ideas to tangible products that can then be, circulated within respective countries, exported, imported? How can we then trade amongst ourselves, right? So kudos, of course, to the AU and other regional economic blocs for the Continental Free Trade Area. It's been a long time coming. It's in trial mode right now, with various countries trying that out, right? So let's just accelerate that and quickly learn, right? What can we learn from all of that? The movement of young Africans, as Prof was saying earlier, the exchange of goods and services, right? But particularly movement. We have a lot of young Africans who are dying at sea, trying to get to Europe, trying to go to all these other places, because it's far much better for them to embark on these perilous journeys across, seas and oceans than it is to stay in their countries. That's really sad if you think about it, right? So how can we then harness this potential and say, look, we have all these resources. I'm speaking to you right now from Joburg in South Africa, which was like, one of those icons or one of those beacons of hope on the continent. But, there's serious energy. There's an energy crisis in this country. So how are we going to run businesses effectively? How are we going to start businesses effectively if a country like South Africa is struggling to meet its energy needs? But at the same time, you have a country like, say, the DRC, which, if you could have something done at the Inga Dam there, you could actually provide electricity to maybe half the continent, if not all of the continent, right? So these are serious things that we need to discuss and really just say, can we get it done for the sake of the continent and for the sake of posterity?
Right. Well, I still have you, Levi. I mean, we've heard from Prof right here in studio. He actually brought up a very important issue on, how do we infect the other African countries with the good practices that are happening within, some of the African countries that are thriving. He did mention some of the good practices that are happening right here in Rwanda, especially on the issues of good governance. However, what we see is fragmentation. Most of the African countries will continue or seem to be continuing to work in isolation in that particular case. What would be able to spark that uniformity or trying to learn from each other and moving on the same direction?
Right. I do not want to sound very idealistic, Eugene, but I really think that the breed of young Africans that is coming up, which does not really have much affinity to saying, to want to leave the continent, to want to then, see things differently. I think they represent the biggest hope for us, just by virtue of saying, the demands on the political leadership are going to be significantly different. And I think, if the politics is right, we just have to ask and demand for better, really. And we have to elect different leaders who think differently, leaders who at the core are thinking about the future of the continent. So I think, there's going to be a shift, and we're not immune to what's happening globally. There are shifts, very significant shifts that are happening, which also Africa is not insulated from. So I think we're entering a stage or an era in which there are going to be very rapid changes that are going to happen, and sooner or later, countries that are not even prepared for that transition or for that change are just going to find themselves in a position where they have to rapidly adapt or rapidly change. But I think at the heart of it all, Africans must just, if we can shame each other, let's just shame each other so that we do better, really. If we can learn from each other, let's learn from each other. Things around movement, for example, in this day and age, to really be saying, a person from, Rwanda needs a visa to get into Malawi, that's like really super sad. We should just be arriving at each other's borders and saying, hey, I'm here, I'm from Malawi. I'm here to do A, B, C, D. Can you let me in? Sure. With open arms, these are the opportunities that you can exploit in a particular country. So these are things that we have to agitate for as young Africans, or youngish Africans in my case. But I think it's really one of those steps that gets us going to exchanging ideas, to exchanging practices, and also actually then exchanging resources in a useful and productive manner.
Very interesting indeed. And of course, looking at the aspect of the funding, I want to go back to that just a bit, and I'm going to bring in Angel on this, because we know that, the entire peace and security budget of around $279 million is still largely funded by the donors. And what we also know is that since 2010, official development assistance has been declining, and it is falling to its lowest level of about $34 billion in 2022, and access to international capital markets is starting to remain a bit constrained and costly due to investors' perceptions of high risk when it comes to some of the investments within the continent. The more the continent continues to rely on international donors to fund an important element like security, what are the risks that we're looking at here, and how do we untangle ourselves from this web that is very dangerous?
So I love African proverbs. I'm going to give you a very short answer. Let you leave your imagination elaborate on that. En français, on dit la main qui donne au-dessus de la main qui est. The hand who gives always on top of the hand who receives.
The hand
That's
that
a
gives.
very short answer to that.
The hand that gives is the one that receives. So someone is giving because they're expecting something in the end.
Absolutely. So who's fueling the war? Especially our challenges, our security challenges are not always due to internal forces. They're very influenced by external forces. So you know what happened when Libya fell. So you see Boko Haram almost everywhere. But who is benefiting from that? We're not producing weapons. So how are we supporting them? Who's paying the bill? At the end of the day, who are the victims? Children and women. So it comes down to our leaders. I don't know how, maybe we're happy on that. I don't know what mechanism we need to create to make sure our leaders are doing the right thing. Because we are South Sudan going sad at the moment. South Sudan came up 10 years ago. They managed to maintain peace. The entire Sahel, Mali, the French are leaving Mali and Burkina Faso. Are they linked to a situation there? It's really complicated, it's highly political. And we are the victim of the current geopolitical situation. And this is really sad for us. And I hope that our leaders, we be courageous enough to make bold statements. We cannot expect too much from African Union because politically their hands are really tight. They're not paying for the peacekeepers. They don't even have strong influence on the African countries. They can be best negotiators, but they cannot have direct influence on the country, knowing that even the sanctions sometimes, which is the mechanism put in place that the regime want to influence those leaders, is not always effective. Sanctions always only works when the entire world is applying the same sanction, like apartheid, for example. If you apply sanction in the country and other countries are trading with them, it's counterproductive. So I just think our leaders should be bold enough to sit down and think about their own the future of the country, of the continent, and the future of the leaders, instead of being motivated by a selfish agenda. The President Goodluck Jonathan said, I don't know what the statement was exactly. It's like, my personal ambition is not worth the peace of the country.
Correct.
So
Correct.
personal ambition in Africa should not be putting stability in jeopardy.
Right. That's powerful, and I like the proverb you mentioned about the hand that gives is the hand that is actually expecting something in the end on that particular note. Prof, I mean, let's talk a bit about that, because look, even in the Sudan situation today, it had to be America that actually brokered a truce, in terms of the ceasefire, which has had its own challenges right there. But when we talk about security on the continent being funded largely by the external forces, let's talk a bit about the risks on that, and how do we untangle ourselves out of this?
Yeah, it's unfortunate to see most of the resources that are supposed to go to development are going to finance wars and conflict in the region. And again, this still comes, I normally like to say that at a certain point we should not blame the history. What philosophy are we embracing? Yeah. And what are we learning from in the past? Because I don't think those people are fighting in Sudan or in different countries in Africa. Look at the Boko Haram. Yeah. Look at all this Sahel part of the country, challenges that they are facing, or different wars in different parts of the region. You will find these are the Africans fighting, killing other Africans. Other external forces, but those external forces are mostly welcomed by Africans themselves. So the responsibility remains to Africans because they are the ones to decide whether they like peace or they don't like peace. It's a choice they have to make. So, and why do they get this aid to finance the peace? Because now peace becomes a golden, difficult to achieve. So all resources that are coming, they need to be allocated to all means of stopping war and ensuring that there is peace. We totally understand that peace is a very sine qua non condition to ensure that other development initiatives are in place. You cannot plan or invest when there is no peace. But still, don't we have the capability or the ability, we are the Africans, to say no to the war, to say no for the killing? It's good that now we are in even the 100 days of commemoration of genocide against Tutsi in Rwanda. There are some Rwandans who were able to say, no, I cannot kill. But there were others who were obliged to kill because of the leadership at the time, which was Rwandans, made also by Rwandans. So the ball comes back to the Africans. The responsibility comes back to Africans. I think now they have the ability to analyze and know exactly what is needed to their community. So the choice of the war, the choice of conflict is wrong choice. But that ability of choosing that needs to be improved and choose the best one.
Choose the best one.
Yeah.
Right. I know, Levi, you want to put your voice on this, but as we put our voices on this one, I want us to just read real quickly some of the comments. I have one from Henry Rikaza on Twitter, who actually says, being financially independent means having sufficient income, savings, and investment to live comfortably for life and meeting all one's objectives without relying on a paycheck. I think this is around the area of Africa's dependence on the donor funding. I have one more from Ali Stacey, who says we shouldn't be talking of visa requirements for Africans to African countries. It is overdue, I think, echoing what Levi did mention earlier on. And I want to pick that from you, Levi, as you start giving us your closing remarks. If there's anything that African leaders, the people of the beautiful continent of Africa, are to hear from this conversation tonight, as far as seeking self-reliance for the continent is concerned, what would it be? Very briefly, Levi.
Thanks again, Eugene, and thanks to the viewers who are engaging on the show. I like what Prof said. Peace. This is something that we understate on the continent, but it's the primary condition for all, freedom. And it's every peace-loving African should be committed to condemning, the violence that is visited upon African people, usually on a daily basis. But we must also understand, just as a rejoinder to how we started, in saying, the struggle for independence was a struggle for freedom and economic freedom in particular. Decolonizing is also a process that is filled with so much violence, right? And we have to, to say, if we are having this conversation, Eugene, as I said earlier, 43 years after the Lagos Plan of Action was drafted, and we're still talking about silencing the guns, then we have to look within. And I like what Angel had said earlier about, let's look at who's funding the war, who benefits from the violence that Africa is suffering from, and let's address that, quite productively. But above all, and this is a message to young Africans, the future of this continent is literally in your hands. Let's fight as much as we can to secure our future. Let's fight as much as we can to secure the full promise of the independence that our liberators fought for. Thanks, Eugene.
Thank you, Levi. Angel, what would be your parting shot, if there's anything that you want those who are watching us tonight to go home with, and where will we find the tools for the self-reliance for the continent?
We are all Africans. Africa is you, it's me. So each of us should play his own part. Let us be responsible, be accountable, and make the decision to always serve the continent and not our personal interest. We are living a very important moment. Our forefathers lived the 60s with the independence movement. Now today, in this 2023 and ish, the world is into a turmoil. It is a repositioning politically, and it's a window opportunity that we have. And I hope we leaders will leverage what we have and let's get into a long-term agreement that will maintain the continent in the dark. I think it's feasible, and I always like to quote Nelson Mandela, it's always impossible until it's done. Thank you, Eugene.
Thank you very much. Prof, you have the last word, being here at home.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me also use the quote from Julius Nyerere.
Yes.
He said in 1963, 64, that you don't develop people, but you help them develop themselves. Since we are talking about self-reliance of Africa, can we educate all the youth that we have, the young people, let them have the skills and the knowledge that is needed for them to innovate? Can we create a conducive environment for them to access capital, reduce the interest rate, bring innovative financing models for them to invest and revolutionize the economy of Africa? Number three, can we ensure that there is effective implementation of all these agreements, commitments that are being signed at Africa level, and ensure that there is accountability mechanism to say that, yes, you have done it, no, you have not achieved. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Of course, thank you so much, Prof, for the closing remarks. Of course, let me also say thank you to Levi Kabwato, who's actually is a social and political commentator, and he's been very active on the Pan-African Review platform. And of course, Angel Kwemo, President and CEO of Strategic Group. Thank you for making time for joining us right here on the show. And Professor Alfred Vizoza, who's actually a professor of agricultural economics. Thank you all for being a part of the conversation. And to you who's been watching, those who've been watching and tweeting, and those who've been silently watching, we appreciate you. And the conversation never ends on these four walls. It continues across our digital platforms. So keep talking. Always use the hashtag #TheSummitRW. We'll see you again next week on Wednesday, same time, same place. As always, my name is Eugene. And goodbye for now.